Hello guys, I'm Su. Nice to meet you. It's been a few months again that I haven't made any videos, and I'm not disappeared. I'm just detached from um, YouTube, and I feel like I'm also detached from Europe, from the West, so to speak. I have a feeling that I have never been to the West. Um, Despite of the fact that I was lived in Europe for 10 years, um, I almost threw away completely the nightmare of the life in Europe behind me. Um, and I feel much more comfortable, much more relaxed, and much more human now. Um, I like to quote a phrase from Hannah Arendt, a phrase called fabricated space time. Um, that's a word she used to describe a totalitarian society, like Nazi Germany, for example. And that's exactly the same word I would like to use to describe my experience of living in Europe. And luckily, that fabricated space time now is gone. The nightmare is gone. Today, I want to talk about the origin of Chinese civilization in a common sense and how it differs drastically from um, historical materialism. Um, to quote from Karl Marx, um, the origin of Chinese civilization was agricultural civilization, as I mentioned and explained many times in my previous videos. Um, and I even exemplified from the very old feudal times, like 3,000 years ago, when China was in a feudal age that was very different from the Western feudal age, because Chinese feudal age actually the king distributes lands to the oligarchs, to the aristocracies, and these landlords let the farmers grow things in the lands, and the lands are always divided into 9 squares, and the 8 squares are private land to the farmers. It doesn't mean the private ownership, but the private rights of use. When the farmers grow things in those lands, they can and harvest things and take them as their personal gainings. And in the middle, it's a public land, and the farmers grow things together, and that land, the outcomes of that land goes to the pockets of the landlords, the oligarchs. Um, the Chinese farmers in feudal times lived very happily because they somehow owned their land and they grow things and harvest things by themselves, and they lived in a very harmonious relationship with the landlords, with the oligarchs. And this was very different from the Western feudal ages, in which the serfdom were like slaves to the oligarchs and lived a very harsh, a terrible life. Um, but why was this the case? From my previous videos, I once explained that that's because the origin of Chinese civilization was agricultural civilization, which makes it very different from the um, tribes, from the nomadic tribes. And the Western social form was like nomadic tribes. The environment for nomadic tribes was very harsh. Um, the weather was cold, the food was very few, and they had to travel around and rob things and steal food, etc. They had to live in a very barbaric life because the environment was very harsh, life was harsh, and in comparison, the agricultural civilization in China, um, the origin of the relationship of the harmonious relationship between the farmers and the oligarchy landlords in feudal times um, comes from the need of common defense. So here's a historical fact. About 3,000 years ago, in feudal ages of China, um, there's a need of common defense of Chinese people, of both the farmers and the oligarchs. They have to defend themselves from the invasion of nomadic tribes. So they somehow form a harmonious mutual relationship. It's like the farmers grow food and they also grow some for their landlords because their landlords offer protection for them. Because when nomadic tribes come to harass and invade, it's actually the oligarchs, the aristocracy, these landlords who fought against these invaders, not the farmers. The farmers were relatively peaceful and weaker, and their job was to grow grains, to produce stuff. And the oligarchs, they were kind of stronger, and they had a stronger sense of honor. And it's because it's their land. They kind of had the responsibility to um, to defend their land and to protect their people as well. And the farmers were their people. There was also a kind of moral relationship between the two kind of people, between the Chinese farmers and the Chinese oligarchs. And this moral relationship was the Lord, the stronger ones, protect the weaker ones, but the weaker ones has to offer something in exchange. And this was based on a moral consideration. It's not something like a commercial deal, because the farmers didn't pay taxes like money or real grants to the landlords. They pay back something called helping the landlords grow some food as well. So they pay some labors back. They pay some time back, some time of working back instead of paying some actual material stuff. Um, and this makes it different. This makes it very different from, for example, a pure commercial goods for goods exchange. Because if you think carefully, this relationship is more like a relationship between a husband and wife. A husband is strong and hunt some animals and do some hard work, and the wife is kind of weaker and not as physically strong as the husband, but can do some cloth work, to do some weavings to make cloth for the husband, some soft work. Um, and these two kind of relationships were very similar, as I just explained. Chinese civilization in its core is about the ethical relationship between two human beings, between husband and wife, between father and son, between the king and his people. And in some sense, you can say that all these relationships are the same. Are the same. It's the same kind of moral, ethical relationship between two human individuals. And it's not slave master relationship. And it's also not a commercial deal between the two strangers. And this kind of relationship bears something natural, religious, and beautiful at the same time. Um, and Chinese linguistic origin of the word civilization is also very different from the Western ones. The Chinese word civilization, which is 文明, can be sought within the old Confucian classics, 礼记, 小代理, actually. Um, it means the patterns, the style of the stripes on the cloth, on the piece of cloth is very beautiful and recognizable and clear. So when a combination of patterns um, and style of colors in a piece of cloth is very harmonious, is very beautiful, and is very clear in a aesthetical sense. The Chinese call it 文明, 文明, which literally translates into English is civilization, civilized. And the things, as I just mentioned, are very important, because if you don't know this, if you never heard of this, you would never have proper sense of the origin of Chinese civilization, and also why the relationship between human individuals is very different from that in the West. So I was talking about the feudal times of China, in which the relationship between the farmers and the landlords were kind of harmonious and mutually beneficial. Um, and I had to mention another very important book, 周官, which was written more than 3,000 years ago, actually. And it's a book that talks about a holistic design of Chinese society. Not only the ethical relationships and the courtesy and the morals, philosophy, etc., but also the designs of political system, of the departments of 6 different departments of a political system, and also about how feudal lands should be distributed and their relationship to the king and and etc. Um, and why this 周官, this book is so important, because the Confucius who come much later actually inherited most of the things from this book 周官, and somehow rewrites it and developed into Confucius classics. And what's more important is that China, after the unification, after the great unification of Qing dynasty, although the political system had evolved into something very different from before, the spirit somehow persists. And where did that spirit comes from? It comes precisely from the book 周官. And I just mentioned that 周官once talks about the 6 different departments of the state in the political system. And this system was somehow reincarnated in Tang Dynasty in 7th century, actually. And it was the most prosperous and powerful dynasty of Chinese history, actually. And it attracted people all around the world. If you do a little bit historical research, you know what I'm talking about. The political design of Tang Dynasty was called 三省六部, 三省六部, and 六部, the 6 departments, the idea of 6 departments of a country precisely come from the book 周官, which was written 3,000 years ago. If you understand that the holistic system of Chinese civilization is not something that is born out of one day randomly, but something that bears a spirit that has been developed generations after generations, classics after classics for thousands of years. You would understand that the relationship between the farmers and landlords in feudal times of China was also not something developed in a way that is similar to the Western social contract. No, it was not at all something random that developed in China. Um, Now I want to say something that denounces Karl Marx's dialectical materialism and historical materialism. Um, I assume that my audiences have some basic knowledge of philosophy and they have heard of the Hegel's dialectics, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and how history evolves. And well, actually, I had a video before explaining how I disagreed with this theory, but somehow agreed with it when you apply the theory to the West, but only to the West. Uh, Karl Marx sees history basically a dialectic process um, of the struggle between the deprived, the suppressed class and the master class. And he sees the history when the progress is made is basically synthesis is made. It's basically a thesis and antithesis. And there's a struggle between the two, and after the bloody struggle, and something new was formed. Um, um, Firstly, I want to say that I disagree with that the relationship has ever changed. Any progress has been made? No, not at all in the West. Um, from my point of view, the um, slave society, the feudal society, capitalism society, socialism, communism society in the West are all the same, and there's no progress at all. It's the same. The relationship between the humans are exactly the same. Exactly the same. It's slave master relationship. Um, if you look at feudal society, if you look at the capitalism society, it's the same. The only difference is these new oligarchs eradicated, they killed the old oligarchs, and they become the new oligarchs themselves and become the masters themselves, and start again to treat other people like slaves. It's always a master and slave relationship. And yet, Michael Hudson likes to call today's America a new feudalism in the form of neoliberalism, um, because of the huge gap between the poor and rich, and the most people don't own land, and they don't own anything actually. And in comparison, the relationship between human individuals in China throughout the feudal ages and the ages of one country unification um, has also not changed. It somehow also stays the same. In feudal times, they pay labor to the landlords, and in the age of one country unification, they pay taxes. They pay taxes to the king, but they own their land, and they can harvest their own growings anyway. And this is the same as the case in the feudal age. Um, I once had an interesting dialogue with one of my friends, and our dialogue was focusing on the feudal ages of China, when the oligarchy landlords and the farmers form a common defense union. and form a kind of harmonious relationship and defend themselves together against the invasion of nomadic tribes. And they somehow succeeded. They always successfully defeated the invaders, these nomadic invaders. Um, so the Chinese agricultural civilization persists. So the Chinese civilization persists because they always defeated these nomadic tribes. Um, uh, then I had a interesting conversation with my friend, and I said, "What if they failed? What if they failed? What if they didn't successfully defend against the nomadics?" And then my friend said, "Then it becomes the West. Then it becomes the West." To be more precise, then it would become the West, actually. It would become the West, in which the nomadic barbarians rule, and the only relationship between human beings is a relationship as slave master. Um, Somehow you can say all the relationship in the West is like slave master relationship. Even between the wife and the husband is like slave and master relationship, because the Western man were kind of abusive. You know, they like to abuse, physically abuse their wife. And they enjoy it, and they even invented the word. They call it SM, sadomasochism. They kind of worship and enjoy this kind of relationship. And even Nietzsche said something like, "What? I'm going to meet a woman or something. Then don't forget to take a whip." I still don't have the archaeological evidences of how uh, nomadic tribes conquered the agricultural civilization in the West. This is just a kind of assumption. Um, but I do know Jesus Christ was killed by the Romans in the West, and Jesus Christ was definitely pro-agricultural civilization. Now I want to explain why I disagree with Karl Marx's historical materialism. Because it only applies to the West. If you try to apply it to China, you would say, no, it doesn't fit at all. It doesn't fit at all. China never comes from historical materialism, because the holistic design of Chinese civilization following the great classics was extremely reasonable. Was extremely reasonable. People do not have to behave unreasonably to reach a thesis and antithesis and then fight reach a synthesis. No, the thesis and antithesis, if there are any at all, were already being calculated within a human individual's mind before he do any action. And this is called 中庸之道, the middle way, the Tao of middle way. To become an extremely reasonable human being, you already think of the two extreme forms of things, of thesis and antithesis in your mind. You contemplate very carefully. And the Confucius says, "Sense are 后行." Think three times before you do things. You already think very carefully and bears in mind something very mature, and then you do something as action. The relationship between farmers and landlords was already a synthesis, even before this relationship comes into being. And it was never a thesis and antithesis, but in the West, it's always a thesis and antithesis. It's a master slave, the struggle, the fight, etc. When you are a child, you do things very unreasonably. You don't think because you're like brainless. You just do stupid things and you make mistakes. And then, oh, then you say, Oh, it's an antithesis. Now I learned something. Um, Now it's a synthesis. But if you're an adult, you would never do things in this way. You already think very carefully, and you wouldn't do something which is called a thesis. Both Hegel and Karl Marx like to think of human society in the same way as they think of nature, physical objects, animals, etc. That's because the Western people are savages, are barbarians. They behave like animals and physical objects and nature. They don't think three times before they do things. They don't think at all. They just do things like animals do. And then it causes very serious consequences, and they call it antithesis. If you are a rational human being, if you're not a savage, you would never do thesis. You only do synthesis. The process of dilation must be done before you do things. It's done in your mind, in your careful meditation. And this is called human being. This is called civilized, reasonable human being. Otherwise, you're savages. If you think carefully about the Western society, they feel more like a pre-human society. It's like Chinese 100,000 years ago when they were still on the trees in the caves. Their society was like that. But even 5,000 years ago, Chinese civilization was already evolved into something much higher. And what goes hand in hand with dialectical materialism and historical materialism in the West is religious idealism. Because the barbarian nature of the Western society makes it impossible to practice morality and ethics in real life. They had to put these things in their religion and put this hope of these things, the practice of these things, an afterlife in heaven, something like that. And then it becomes religious idealism. Religious idealism goes hand in hand with historical and dialectical materialism in the West. But morality and ethics can be practiced in Chinese society in real life. So the ancient Chinese society, in certain sense, in the Western sense, is a living heaven. And if you look at the modern Western ideologies, you will see that they all fail and even go to the opposite to what they claims. Um, that's exactly the same mechanism behind them as what I just explained. And what's so sad about the West is the people there, even when they want to be reasonable, they cannot because everything they have is fake. Their history is fake. Their classics is fake. Their religion is fake. It's all made up. It's all fabricated. So they don't have reliable resources that can make them be reasonable. And what their government is doing and has been constantly doing is to make sure their people reject other resources from other culture. Um, Now I want to talk about how Chinese agricultural civilization evolved through time. In the feudal time of China, the Chinese oligarchs owned the land, and the farmers didn't own the land, but they owned the rights of use of lands. And they were protected by the oligarchs. The oligarchs protect them from being harassed and invaded by barbarians, as I explained. And the farmers paid labor back. But time after time, the techniques developed actually. especially the technique of making iron stuff. Um, the China somehow managed to develop the very advanced technology that and they can make very strong, very handy, very useful iron stuff very easily. And they made a lot of the tools, agricultural tools, which makes them much more effective, much more productive when they grow grains in land. Um, and when this happens, the farmers start to obtain more land without the permission of landlords, because China was very big, and the land was very big. So apart from the land that the oligarchs attributes to them, there were still wasted lands everywhere. There were still empty lands everywhere. But for some reason, they didn't have time, they didn't have energy, they didn't have the tools to grow things in those lands because they were already tired enough and occupied enough to grow things in the land that were attributed to them. But when the technology developed, now they have very advanced tools, things become different. So they start to have more spare time. They're like, okay, I already finished this land and I still have energy and time. What can I do? Uh, okay, what if I just push a bit further and just grow some more things beyond this grid of land, bit after bit. Um, in the beginning, the oligarchs disagree with that. Um, um, but the farmers were like, oh, what can I do? I still have time and energy. I just want to grow things in these empty lands. And this, you don't use these lands anyway. What a waste. Why not growing something there? Um, and somehow the oligarchs find it makes sense. So they agreed with it. They let people grow more things in more lands, but they had to pay taxes according to the amount of the things they grow. Now here you can see a development, a big change of taxes, because before the tax was in the form of labor. They just have to spend some labor in the public land to grow things in the public land, and that things goes to the landlord. But now uh, they pay just actual grants, actual materials, actual products as taxes. And this is a big change actually. And the oligarchs agreed with this also because the farmers started to become lazy in doing their labors in the public land. Because the more they spend time in their private land and in their extended private land, the less voluntarily they like to spend time in the public land. So the things in the public land didn't grow well anymore. So the oligarchs just find out, yes, maybe it's better for both of us. Maybe it's better for both of us. Now you grow more things for yourself, but I also will not lose things. I will also receive more grants in the end. Um, from the perspective of commercial society, this is a good thing. But from the perspective of moral relationship of Chinese culture, this is a bad thing, actually. Because the relationship between the farmers and landlords become corrupted a bit. And people become more greedy, become more caring about their own stuff. There's a kind of greed growth that was not there before. This is like a relationship between husband and wife. In the beginning, The husband makes food, makes cook rice, cook food for her because he loves her, and he gets some flowers as a gift and give it to his wife. But later he become busy because of work or something. He wants to make more money. Then he's too lazy to do those things, but he still wants to show that he loves his wife. So what he does is he just spend money buying some stuff and give it to his wife. Um, this is a metaphor. This is a comparison in modern society. Um, but when this happens, actually um, relationship, the connection between husband and wife is weakened, becomes weaker and weaker actually. Um, and actually, after Zhou Dynasty, in spring autumn time, and also the uh, warlord time, the things become more corrupted and more complicated because some farmers just escaped from their land, escaped from their landlords, and start to cultivate some random lands in the far wild places. And just didn't do their responsibility as they were supposed to do. And there was another social class was born at the time, which was the commercial class. There comes a professional, a career, a commercial businessman start to trade lands and trade stuff, etc. Um, but you may ask, then who would protect these farmers from being harassed and invaded by the barbarians then? Well, if you look carefully, because as I mentioned, the technologies of making iron tools and stuff becomes much more advanced. So the technology of making weapons, iron weapons, metal weapons also become more advanced. So people actually become stronger in fighting and defending themselves against barbarians. Uh, and what also happened was money was born because there was enough iron and people started to use iron to make money. This was directly linked to the birth of the commercial businessman class. And time after time, things become more out of control. And eventually, this old feudal system cannot be maintained at all. It's broken. It's not there anymore. And the countries had to make a new system that gave the private ownership of land to ordinary farmers. So if you grow things in a remote land, you can just have it. This is your land, and you can own this land, and you just need to pay taxes to the king of a country. And this caused the war between the oligarchs and the king, because before people were paying taxes to oligarchs, and now that they just the people have private land and pay taxes to the king, and this was a big loss to the old oligarchs. um, and Eventually they had seven different countries, um, all evolved to a kind of new system, but fought with each other, had constant wars, and in the end, one country, Qing, the country Qing, defeated all other countries and united China, and it became one unified Chinese civilization. It's a new system, the first unified civilization dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty. Um, Many things have changed in this new form of society compared to the old feudal society of China, but the spirit stays the same. The new system actually preserved and re-established the old morality and ethics that the old feudal system somehow lost after time, after um, um, 1,000 years actually, because the last feudal dynasty was Zhou, which was disappeared in 9th century, and the first dynasty of one unified China was in 2nd century BC. I'm sorry, 3rd century BC. So that was like around 700 years. The relationship between people and the king in Qing dynasty was very similar to the relationship between the farmers and oligarchs in the feudal Zhou dynasty. And the unified Wan China as a whole becomes much more effective in defending themselves against the nomadic barbarians. The Qing dynasty of China, in certain sense, was just a bigger expansion of the old system of the feudal landlord, one small region. Um, if you look at Chinese history further, you would find something very interesting because when serious political, social problems happens, economic problem happens, um, the intellectuals, the politicians actually look at the old feudal ages of China and want to borrow the ideas from the old feudal system again in some other forms back to China. I actually want to talk about how intellectuals and politicians in the later dynasties of China reform land policies in order to deal with economic problems by borrowing ideas from the old feudal ages of China. But this is a little bit too complicated to explain, and um, probably I should once make a separate video focusing on this topic. Um, and today I think that would be too much if I expand about this point. So I would rather stop for today um, and take a break. Um, okay. Um, hope to see you next time. Bye.